Good evening. You're looking live at Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where SpaceX is rolling a Falcon Heavy rocket to the pad this evening in preparation for a test firing of its 27 main engines as soon as tomorrow. This rollout is in advance of the planned launch of the Falcon Heavy rocket, scheduled for Halloween Day, October 31st, that is next Monday, carrying a mission into orbit for the United States Space Force. This is the first time we've seen a Falcon Heavy rocket to roll out of the hangar in 3.5 years here at Kennedy Space Center. You're looking at the transporter erector on the left-hand side of that building with the SpaceX and US flag insignia there on the side of that structure. That's the hangar where SpaceX integrates Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets with their payloads. And the Falcon Heavy rocket is riding that transporter erector on the way up the ramp to pad 39A. This is about a quarter-mile journey that will take several hours this evening. And once the rocket is on the pad, SpaceX will raise it vertical in preparation for this planned static fire test of the 27 main engines tomorrow. I'm Stephen Clark. I'm editor of spaceflightnow.com. I'll be providing periodic updates throughout the evening as the Falcon Heavy rocket makes its way up the ramp to pad 39A. And of course, we'll be covering the static fire test tomorrow live as well on a stream with live commentary. And as usual, we'll be covering the launch of the Falcon Heavy rocket on Monday with the USSF 44 mission. That's the United States Space Force 44 mission, carrying multiple satellites into geosynchronous orbit. We're now seeing one of the side boosters of the Falcon Heavy rocket emerging from the hangar. You can see the SpaceX logo, that stylized X there visible on one of these side boosters. The Falcon Heavy, of course, is made up by combining 3 Falcon booster cores together. That triples the liftoff thrust of the Falcon 9 rocket. And instead of 9 engines for the Falcon 9, we're going to see 27 engines firing in unison when this rocket takes off next week. This mission is using a Falcon Heavy rocket with 3 brand new booster cores. So all 3 boosters on this rocket are brand new. They've actually been built and were delivered to Kennedy Space Center more than a year ago now to prepare for this launch for the U.S. Space Force. This launch has been delayed 2 years, primarily due to payload-related delays with the spacecraft that this rocket will be carrying into orbit. But those spacecraft are now ready. The Falcon Heavy rocket is ready and integrated. It's been integrated inside that hangar in the last couple of weeks. The Falcon Heavy for this static fire test is not fitted with the payload fairing or the payload. So it'll be what we know as what we call a headless rocket without the nose cone on board for this static fire test. And once the test firing is complete, SpaceX will secure the vehicle, drain its tanks, and then lower it and return it to the hangar where technicians will integrate the payload fairing and the military satellites onto the rocket for liftoff next week from pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Again, this rollout is going to take several hours. It'll likely won't be concluded until after dark here on Florida Space Coast. We'll bring you these views throughout the evening, and we'll, of course, be streaming live views of pad 39A throughout the next few days leading up to launch next week. Also, in recent weeks, technicians at pad 39A have been reconfiguring hardware such as the reaction frame, which is the structure on which the rocket is mounted, to modify that for the configuration that is necessary for the triple core Falcon Heavy rocket. The last launch from this pad and from this strong back and reaction frame was back on October the 5th with SpaceX and NASA's Crew 5 mission, which launched a crew of 4 astronauts and cosmonauts to the International Space Station. As you can see, the Falcon Heavy and the transporter erector that is carrying it up the ramp here has paused just outside the door, the north door of the SpaceX hangar. This is usual practice for SpaceX as they wheel the rocket on rails out of the hangar and then head up that quarter-mile distance to the launch mount at Pad 39A. We're likely to see several starts and stops throughout the evening as the rocket makes its way to the launch pad. Again, rollout began less than 15 minutes ago. About 15 minutes ago from the hangar at Pad 39A, which is located just outside the gate to the pad, the old gate to Pad 39A that dates back to the Space Shuttle and Saturn V rocket days. The hangar is actually built on top of the crawlerway that NASA used to transport space shuttles and Saturn V rockets to the pad. SpaceX does not use the crawlerway, and instead of using the vehicle assembly building, this massive, iconic 52-story tall building that NASA uses for the Artemis program now, was originally built for the Apollo programs. SpaceX constructed this much smaller hangar for horizontal integration of their rockets. You can see up close here, the Falcon Heavy is parked just outside that open door on the north side of the hangar now. If you're just joining us and haven't done so yet, I'm going to appeal to you to please hit the like button on our stream. That helps us gain a larger following and a larger audience to bring this coverage to as many people as possible for those who might be interested in this activity. Again, you're watching the rollout of SpaceX's fourth Falcon Heavy rocket to Pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. If you're just joining us, you're looking at a live view of the SpaceX hangar, and the Falcon Heavy rocket has just fully emerged from that hangar out at Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And as you can see, there is no payload fairing attached to this rocket for the rollout today. That's because the Falcon Heavy is heading to the pad for a static fire test scheduled for tomorrow. During this static fire test, SpaceX's launch team will load the rocket with kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants, and they will run a simulated countdown all the way down to engine start. And all 27 Merlin engines on the Falcon Heavy rocket, 9 on each booster core, will be ignited for just shy of 10 seconds, we expect, while hold down restraints keep the Falcon Heavy firmly on the pad at Complex 39A. This is a test of the Falcon Heavy systems as well as ground systems at pad 39A to ensure that all is in readiness for a liftoff next week. That launch next week is scheduled for Monday, October 31st. The launch window opens at 9:44 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 13:44 UTC. And the mission will be carrying multiple satellites into a near geosynchronous orbit more than 20,000 miles over the equator for the United States Space Force. This, again, is the fourth flight of a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket and the first in more than 3 years. The last launch of a Falcon Heavy occurred in June of 2019. So it's been a long time coming for this Falcon Heavy launch. This is one of as many as 6 Falcon Heavy rockets that SpaceX has scheduled over the next 12 months. Several of these launches, including this one, have been delayed months or years in some cases due to delays with their payloads. There has not been any issue that we're aware of with the rocket. In fact, the Falcon Heavy boosters for this particular mission were delivered to Kennedy Space Center last year, a year ago now, to get into place for this launch. This launch was originally scheduled for late 2020 when the military awarded the launch contract to SpaceX, and now is scheduled again for launch on October 31st, carrying multiple satellites into a near geosynchronous orbit for the U.S. Space Force. We're now seeing the Falcon Heavy rocket become a little more visible as it clears the tree line heading up this incline to Launch Complex 39A. You can see one of the nose cones of the one of the 3 Falcon booster cores sticking just above the tree line there, with its titanium grid fins there as well. For this particular mission, SpaceX will aim to recover the 2 side boosters with near simultaneous landings back at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Those boosters will return to shore for a return to launch site landing for refurbishment and reuse on a future Falcon Heavy flight. The core stage for this mission will be expended. There is no plan to recover the core stage either onshore or on one of SpaceX's drone ships. And that's because this particular mission requires a lot of performance from the Falcon Heavy. The upper stage will be performing multiple burns with a nearly 6 hour long coast period in between them to place the Space Force payloads into a near geosynchronous orbit. Again, that's about 22,000 miles or so, or nearly 36,000 kilometers over the equator. And that requires a coast of the upper stage to that high altitude after an initial boost out of the atmosphere. And then the upper stage will have to reignite roughly 6 hours. We haven't seen the exact launch timeline yet, although we expect to see that in the coming days. But roughly 6 hours after launch, that upper stage will reignite for a burn to both circularize the orbit at an altitude of, again, 22,000 or so miles. And that upper stage burn will also take out some of the inclination of the orbit. So it will maneuver the payloads closer to their final operating orbit directly over, or nearly directly over, the equator. The launch pad area here at Kennedy Space Center is about 20.5 to 28.5 degrees or so north latitude. So the upper stage will do the work to take out that inclination from 28.5 degrees to near zero. We also haven't got the exact orbital parameters. Sometimes on these types of missions, they target 1 or 2 degrees off the equator to avoid directly injecting the satellites into geosynchronous orbit, because they want to run these satellites through tests before they take a slot in geosynchronous orbit, which is somewhat congested with operating satellites and space debris. So they want to avoid creating more space debris in case one of these satellites fails or has a problem. And they also don't want to leave the upper stage in a geosynchronous orbit as well. They want to put it in what's known as a graveyard type orbit, just off geosynchronous altitude and just off geosynchronous inclination. But this will be the first SpaceX mission that will do this type of direct injection to geosynchronous orbit, again, taking more than 6 hours from liftoff until payload deployment. If you look closely on the upper stage of the Falcon Heavy rocket, you can see a gray band. That's some paint or insulation that's been added around the kerosene tank on the upper stage. That's there and necessary to keep that kerosene tank from freezing, the fuel inside it from freezing during this long 6 hour coast up to geosynchronous altitude. This will be the longest SpaceX mission to date from launch until payload separation. So it's like really testing the capability of the Falcon Heavy rocket to do this type of direct injection. Other rockets have done this. ULA has done this type of orbit injection with their Delta IV Heavy, as well as the Atlas V rocket. And Russia has also done this type of direct injection with their Proton and Angara rockets as well. Falcon Heavy really coming into view now, heading up the ramp to pad 39A. If you look there behind and to the left of the rocket, you can see one of the cranes vertical that's supporting the construction of SpaceX's Starship orbital launch site at Kennedy Space Center. SpaceX is building a new Starship pad at KSC alongside the existing Starship pad down in Texas. We've seen that the tower at pad 39A be erected over the summer and now stands more than 450 feet tall. And right now, SpaceX teams at the pad are working to outfit that tower and prepare it for future Starship testing and future launches of SpaceX's next generation Starship and Super Heavy rocket program. But in the meantime, pad 39A will continue supporting Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy missions until SpaceX eventually wants to fully retire the Falcon rocket family as well as the Dragon spacecraft family and focus on the Starship program. But that's still many years away until the Starship is fully vetted and tested and also human rated before SpaceX will be able to move ahead with retiring the Falcon rocket program. Really great view here of the Falcon Heavy just emerging above the tree line there in a gap in the brush on Florida Space Coast. This camera is located about 3 to 3.5 miles away from the pad, but some great visibility this evening at KSC. You can see the SpaceX logo on one of the side boosters there. You can see the landing legs at the base of that side booster, as well as the grid fins that will help that booster guide itself and steer itself back through the atmosphere for landing at landing zone 1 and 2. These two side boosters will be coming back to the Cape for landing less than 10 minutes after launch. Again, this Falcon Heavy rocket is scheduled to lift off next Monday. That it is October 31st, with the launch window opening at 9:44 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That is 13:44 UTC for those of you in other time zones. This will be the fourth flight of a Falcon Heavy rocket and the first operational Falcon Heavy flight for the U.S. Space Force. Of course, the first Falcon Heavy launch back in 2018 was purely a demonstration mission. It carried a Tesla Roadster into heliocentric orbit on an Earth escape trajectory as a demonstration of the Falcon Heavy's capabilities. That was in February of 2018. The Falcon Heavy launched 2 more times in April and June of 2019 for Arabsat with a geostationary communications satellite for the Saudi telecom company. And then in June for the U.S. military, for the DoD, Department of Defense, with a cluster, a rideshare mission of military and NASA experimental and technology demonstration payloads. This mission is classified as an operational national security space launch mission with multiple Space Force satellites on board. As you can see, though, the payload fairing is missing from the rocket. This is because SpaceX will conduct a test firing of this vehicle tomorrow without the payload on board. All 27 engines on the rocket on the first stage cores will ignite on the pad. The rocket will remain on the ground during this test firing. And then if all goes according to plan, SpaceX will lower the rocket back horizontal and return it down the same path to the hangar for integration with its Space Force payloads, as well as the payload fairing. And then it will be returned to the pad likely sometime this weekend if everything remains on schedule for the launch attempt on Monday. We've tightened the view a little bit to show you some more detail of the Falcon Heavy rocket as it's riding the transporter erector up the ramp to pad 39A. You can see the side booster here on the camera side of the rocket facing us. This is one of the 3 first stage boosters on the Falcon Heavy, each with 9 engines. Of course, you can see the SpaceX livery there, the SpaceX logo, and the word SpaceX on the side of the Falcon Heavy side booster. At the base of the rocket, on the left of this view, you can see the 4 landing legs retracted up against the body of the booster. And at the top, near the nose cone, there are 4 grid fins, 2 of which are visible here. These are the titanium grid fins used for aerodynamic stability during reentry and recovery and landing of the first stage boosters. And then on the right-hand side is the upper stage of the Falcon Heavy with the gray band of paint or insulation there. That's a thermal insulator on the kerosene tank of the upper stage. That is kind of a unique attribute for this mission. And then at the very top of the rocket is a plate on top of the upper stage where SpaceX technicians later this week expect to integrate the Space Force payloads for this upcoming launch onto the rocket. That will be done after the static fire test is completed. That static fire is scheduled as soon as tomorrow. And liftoff of this rocket, launch of this mission, is currently targeted for Monday, October 31st. If you are just joining us and you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream because that helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. This is the first time a Falcon Heavy rocket has been seen at Kennedy Space Center outside of the hangar in 3.5 years. And we want to bring this coverage to as many people as possible. So for everyone who's interested to be able to see this, if you hit the like button, that really helps us out to extend our coverage to a larger audience. While we continue to watch SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket move up the ramp at pad 39A, we want to give a big thank you to those of you who have contributed in the super chat and donations here on YouTube. We also want to thank those of you who are already members of our YouTube channel who've joined. If you haven't done that, we'll invite you to join our YouTube channel now, because that really helps us continue to bring you live coverage like this. We stream all launches from here on Florida Space Coast, and of course we maintain coverage of the wider space industry and launches around the world on spaceflightnow.com. And for us to be able to continue to do this and to expand and grow with the growing launch rate, your support is needed. So for those of you who have already become members, we thank you. For those of you who haven't, please consider doing that to support our coverage. And you'll also be gaining access to bonus video features for members only that we have here on YouTube. The Falcon Heavy rocket is just passing in front of the Starship launch pad, which is under construction out at pad 39A. This again is for SpaceX's future Starship and Super Heavy program, which ultimately SpaceX is designing to replace the Falcon rocket program. But the Falcon rocket still has many years of operation left, and the Falcon Heavy is currently SpaceX's most powerful operational rocket, and it's also the most powerful operational rocket in the world right now, soon to be potentially eclipsed by two different rockets, SpaceX's Starship when it makes its first full-up orbital test flight, as well as NASA's Space Launch System for the Artemis moon program. As you can see in these live views from Kennedy Space Center, we're approaching sunset. Sunset officially is at 6:43 p.m. Eastern Time. Just about a minute from now is the official sunset time. So it's going to be getting darker here on Florida Space Coast, but we will bring you views throughout the evening as the Falcon Heavy continues its quarter-mile journey up the ramp to pad 39A in preparation for a static fire test tomorrow, and that'll be followed by a launch next week. As night is falling at Kennedy Space Center, we're continuing to watch live views of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket. If you look really closely, you can actually see some of the personnel around the transporter erector walking down the ramp at the pad. That's a good reference for scale of this enormous rocket. Fully stacked with the payload on board, the Falcon Heavy stands 230 feet tall. That's about 70 meters in height. That's the same height as SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. The big difference is the width in terms of size. The rocket with the 3 Falcon booster cores together is about 40 feet wide. That's about 12.2 meters in width, with 3 of the Falcon boosters bolted together. The rocket is capable of delivering about 140,000 pounds. That's 64 metric tons or so to low Earth orbit. And that number assumes no recovery of the boosters. Of course, the booster recovery does eat into the performance and lift capability of the rocket. And again, assuming a fully expendable launch, the Falcon Heavy is capable of delivering about 37,000 pounds or 16.8 metric tons on a trajectory escaping Earth toward Mars. For this mission, USSF-44 for the U.S. Space Force, the objective is to place several, or multiple at least, small satellites into geosynchronous orbit about 22,000 miles or 36,000 kilometers over the equator. This launch, again, is scheduled for Monday, October 31st, with a launch window opening at 9:44 a.m. Eastern Time or 13:44 UTC. And the rocket is currently rolling out to the pad in preparation for a test firing of its 27 main engines tomorrow. As you can see, it's getting a bit darker at Kennedy Space Center. Sunset was about 10 minutes ago. And there are some lights out at the pad, at pad 39A itself. Once the rocket reaches the top of the incline there, that will illuminate the pad and the rocket when it gets closer. But there are no lights, no spotlights or any floodlights along the ramp leading from the hangar to the pad. Here's a wide shot showing a bit more detail of what I'm talking about. You can see those lights at the pad around the launch mount area where the Falcon Heavy will be lifted vertical, likely sometime overnight or early tomorrow morning. That will provide some lighting on the vehicle when it gets there. But until then, the Falcon Heavy will be in darkness as nightfall arrives here in Florida. But of course, if you stay with us, we're going to bring you continuous live views throughout the Falcon Heavies, the rest of the Falcon Heavies rollout to the pad, and we'll be streaming on YouTube continuous views of the rocket on the pad throughout the next few days leading up until the launch scheduled for Monday morning. We'll also be on live for commentary and live coverage for the test firing of the 27 main engines that is currently targeted for sometime tomorrow, and we'll be covering the launch itself live as well. If you're just joining us, welcome. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of spaceflightnow.com, reporting on the rollout of SpaceX's fourth Falcon Heavy rocket to Pad 39A this evening. This move that you're watching live is in preparation for a test firing of the rocket at the pad scheduled for tomorrow or Wednesday. All this is in preparation for the launch of the U.S. Space Force's USSF-44 mission. That mission is currently targeted for launch on Monday, October 31st, or Halloween, at 9:44 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 13:44 UTC. The Falcon Heavy rocket is riding the transporter erector up the incline to Pad 39A. It's well past the halfway point now on this quarter-mile journey from SpaceX's hangar to the launch mount itself out at the pad. You're watching views from our camera position at Kennedy Space Center, about 3 miles away from Pad 39A. You can see some of the personnel walking around the transporter this evening. That's a good representation of the scale of this Falcon Heavy rocket. This is the first time we've seen a Falcon Heavy rolling to the pad at Kennedy Space Center since June of 2019, when SpaceX launched the third and most recent Falcon Heavy mission. The Falcon Heavy, of course, is SpaceX's most powerful rocket. It's also the most powerful rocket currently operational anywhere in the world, with more than 5 million pounds of thrust from 27 Merlin engines at launch. That power is capable of putting a payload of some 64 metric tons, or about 140,000 pounds, into low Earth orbit. That is roughly double, more than double, the capability of any other rocket currently flying in the world. But as I've mentioned a few minutes ago in my updates, that figure will soon be eclipsed by two different rockets, one of which is SpaceX's own Starship rocket. That's the fully reusable super heavy lift rocket in development by SpaceX. And the other is NASA's Artemis 1, or Space Launch System moon rocket, rather, that's scheduled for launch on the Artemis 1 lunar test flight later this year. Both of those will eclipse the Falcon Heavy's lift capability by a significant margin. Behind the Falcon Heavy rocket, I mentioned the Starship. Behind the Falcon Heavy rocket in this view is the Starship launch site, the second orbital launch pad for the Starship program that SpaceX is building here at Kennedy Space Center, alongside the already built pad that's being tested and outfitted and ready for the first Starship launch from South Texas. Continue to bring you periodic updates as the Falcon Heavy makes its way to the pad. Again, it has a few hundred feet to go to reach the position above the flame trench at Pad 39A. And at that point, we expect a pause in the action, at least from a visual perspective from this angle, for a few hours until SpaceX is ready to raise this rocket vertical, likely sometime overnight or very early tomorrow morning, in preparation for that test firing tomorrow. As you can see, the motion has resumed. We hope to get better lighting on the rocket in the next few minutes. You can see one of the light stands on the left of this particular view. So once the rocket is past that point, we expect to see better lighting on the vehicle. Again, it's about 30 minutes, about 25 minutes now since sunset here on Florida Space Coast. So the rocket is moving into the lit illuminated area around the launch pad. So stick with us. We expect better views shortly. Again, if you're just joining us, you're watching live views of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket on the way to Pad 39A, nearing its destination right now in the home stretch of this rollout, in preparation for a test firing of the 27 Merlin engines on the 3-booster rocket tomorrow. Of course, the astute among you will note that the payload fairing is not attached to the rocket for this rollout. It is customary for SpaceX for customer missions not to have the payload on board for test firings of their rockets. So the payload fairing and the satellites that this rocket will be boosting into orbit are not attached to the rocket right now. After the test firing is completed tomorrow, SpaceX will drain propellants from the vehicle, lower it back horizontal. It'll return to the hangar following this very same route. And then once in the hangar, SpaceX technicians will integrate the payload fairing and the satellites onto the rocket. Those satellites and the payload fairing are being prepared for launch at an off-site facility elsewhere at the spaceport here in Florida. And we expect those to either already have been moved or will soon be moved to the hangar at Pad 39A for integration with the Falcon Heavy rocket. In this wide view, you can get a good sense of the lay of the land at Pad 39A. See the Falcon Heavy rocket nearing its destination for tonight's rollout over the flame trench, just to the right of that tower on the left side of your screen here. Near the center of the screen in this field of view is the tower for SpaceX's future Starship rocket launch pad in Florida. And then off to the right, in the darkness, although if you look closely, you can see the outline of the building, and the light from one of the doors is the hangar, the integration building where this rollout began, where the Falcon Heavy and its boosters and upper stage were integrated over the last few days to weeks. And then that rocket was then raised onto the transporter erector by a crane over the last 36 hours or so. And all that paved the way and led to the rollout that you're watching live in these views from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button on our stream here. That will help us gain a larger audience for our coverage. We want as many people watching this exciting mission as possible. This is just the first of many or of multiple live streams we have planned over the coming days. We'll be streaming the static fire test of this rocket tomorrow. And of course, we'll be covering the full countdown and launch of the Falcon Heavy rocket, currently scheduled for Monday, October the 31st. Amid all that, in between all that, we'll be maintaining a continuous live stream on YouTube as well, showing static views of the pad, live shots 24/7 of the Falcon Heavy at Pad 39A leading up to the launch next week. This is a rather slow process. It takes generally a couple of hours at least for each of these rollouts to the pad to be completed. And then once the rocket is at the pad over the flame trench in alignment, it'll take several more hours before SpaceX begins the process of lifting the rocket vertical with this hydraulic erector arm. The actual process of lifting it vertical generally goes fairly quickly. It takes less than 30 minutes, sometimes 15 to 20 minutes to raise the rocket vertical. But before they can even start that, they have to make sure the rocket is all properly aligned at the pad over the flame trench, right in the perfect position, and then complete their final preps to raise the rocket vertical. We expect that to happen based on past experience sometime overnight or very early tomorrow morning. can see here, the Falcon Heavy rocket is now being illuminated once again by these lights that encircle pad 39A, and it's nearing its destination tonight, just maybe 100 to 200 feet at most remaining in this rollout, which began nearly 2 hours ago with the departure from SpaceX's hangar about a quarter mile south of the pad. And this transporter erector has been carrying the rocket up the ramp. And with nightfall now here on Florida Space Coast, the rollout is nearing completion. Thanks for sticking with us as we continue live coverage of the rollout of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket at Pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Still about 100 feet or so to go, give or take, before we can call the rollout complete. It's the transporter erector that's hauling the rocket to the pad needs to reach the point of around those three vertical structures on the left-hand side of your screen before the rollout can be declared complete. And at that point, the Falcon Heavy will be in position to be raised vertical. We don't expect that to occur for at least 6 hours is generally the minimum from rollout until a rocket is able to be raised vertical based on SpaceX's past performance. So we don't expect the rocket to be vertical until sometime overnight or early tomorrow morning. And that is in preparation for this test firing. We'll see all 27 Merlin engines light for up to 10 seconds, just shy of 10 seconds, for a hold down test firing as soon as tomorrow. And this will be followed by the return of the rocket to the hangar, integration with its Space Force payload, and then the rollout back to the pad, likely sometime this weekend for a launch attempt next Monday. We're continuing to watch live views of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket on the home stretch of its rollout at Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You can see the rocket is now well illuminated by these floodlights at the Launch Complex 39A, and the rocket just resumed motion for the final 100 feet or so of its journey tonight. Once in position and aligned directly over the flame trench, SpaceX will begin preparations to raise the Falcon Heavy vertical in preparation for a static fire test as soon as tomorrow. This is the first time a Falcon Heavy rocket has been on the pad here in Florida since June of 2019. That was the most recent Falcon Heavy launch. SpaceX has launched 3 Falcon Heavy missions to date. This is the 4th, although there has been a gap of about 3.5 years since the most recent flight due to payload delays. Several payloads that have been assigned and contracted to fly on SpaceX Falcon Heavy rockets have run into technical issues and delays and supply chain problems. And finally, a Falcon Heavy payload is now ready for flight on this particular rocket, scheduled for liftoff next Monday, October the 31st. This mission will be carrying multiple U.S. Space Force satellites into geosynchronous or near geosynchronous orbit, more than 20,000 miles over the equator. This will be one of SpaceX's most challenging launch profiles to date, with a period of more than 6 hours between liftoff and the deployment of the final payload. Once the static fire test is complete tomorrow, SpaceX will return the rocket to the hangar for integration with its payload, and then we expect to see a second rollout following this same journey to the pad, likely sometime this weekend in preparation for the launch attempt on Monday. Hello, once again, I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now. You're continuing to watch a live view of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket, which has now arrived at Launch Complex 39A after a roughly 2.5-hour journey covering a quarter mile from the integration hangar just south of the pad. This rollout is in preparation for the static fire test of the 27 main engines on the Falcon Heavy rocket scheduled for no earlier than tomorrow. That will be followed by the launch of this vehicle, of this Falcon Heavy rocket, next week. That's currently targeted for October the 31st, Halloween, at 9:44 a.m. Eastern Time, or 13:44 UTC. We expect to see the Falcon Heavy raised vertical sometime overnight or very early tomorrow morning in preparation for the static fire test. Again, as you may notice, the payload fairing and the payloads for this mission are not currently attached to the rocket. So after the test firing, the rocket will have to be lowered and returned to the integration building, the hangar, to meet those payloads for integration. And then the fully assembled rocket will be returned to the pad sometime this weekend for the launch attempt on Monday for the U.S. Space Force's USSF 44 mission. This is the first fully operational national security mission for SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket. We're going to conclude our live commentary on this particular stream right now. However, we have a continuous 24/7 live stream of Pad 39A here on our YouTube channel. You can go to our Spaceflight Now YouTube page, find that, and we'll have continuous live streaming views of Pad 39A throughout the next week leading up to the launch of the Falcon Heavy rocket. And we expect that stream will capture the raising of the Falcon Heavy vertical sometime overnight, or again, very early tomorrow morning. We don't know exactly when that's going to occur right now, but typically it occurs no fewer than 6 to 8 hours after rollout. So we expect that to happen sometime before dawn or shortly after dawn tomorrow if SpaceX remains on schedule. So until next time, thank you for joining us for our live coverage of the rollout of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket. I'm Stephen Clark. I've been reporting, showing our live views from Kennedy Space Center. Again, we'll continue streaming these views elsewhere on our YouTube channel. Check that out. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well for notices and alerts when we're going live with future live coverage. And if you want to support our coverage, consider becoming a member of our YouTube channel as well. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live. Thanks for joining us. Have a great night.